In the quiet hours of your evening, as the familiar world settles into darkness around you, there exists a story so vast and intricate that it spans 2 millennia and encompasses every continent on Earth. Tonight, we'll journey through the rise and fall of history's greatest empires, those magnificent, terrible, and utterly human experiments in organising power across vast territories and diverse populations. Let the day's concerns fade away. Forget about time itself. There's nowhere urgent you need to be, nothing pressing that demands your immediate attention. For the next few hours, we'll walk together through the corridors of power that have shaped our world, from the marble halls of Rome to the forbidden city of Beijing, from the courts of Versailles to the administrative centres of distant colonies that most Europeans never saw. These are not abstract political entities, but living, breathing civilizations built by millions of individual decisions, sustained by complex webs of loyalty and fear, and ultimately undone by the same human ambitions that created them. Each empire believed it would endure forever, yet each discovered that power, like all human achievements, is ultimately temporary. The patterns that emerge from this vast tapestry of conquest and collapse, expansion and retreat, innovation and decay, speak to something fundamental about human nature and the eternal challenge of governing large, diverse populations across great distances. Let's begin this unhurried exploration with an empire so enduring and influential that its collapse marked the end of one age and the beginning of another, though its fall was not the dramatic catastrophe that popular imagination suggests, but rather a slow transformation that unfolded over centuries. Rome, in 117 CE, represented the apex of ancient imperial achievement. Under Emperor Trajan, the empire stretched from the windswept highlands of Scotland to the sun-baked deserts of Mesopotamia, from the Atlantic shores of Portugal to the Black Sea coast of modern Romania. Over 65 million people lived under Roman rule, speaking dozens of languages, worshipping hundreds of gods, and participating in an economic system that connected Britain's tin mines to India's spice markets. The city of Rome itself housed over 1 million inhabitants, making it larger than London would be until the 19th century. The administrative machinery required to govern such a vast territory was staggering in its complexity. Roman law codes, engineering projects, military organisation, and bureaucratic systems created the template for imperial government that would influence European political development for the next 2 millennia. The Roman genius lay not in conquest alone. Many peoples could fight and win battles, but in their remarkable ability to absorb and integrate the societies they conquered. Unlike many ancient empires that ruled through fear and exploitation, Rome offered a path to citizenship, advancement, and participation in imperial culture. A Celtic chieftain's son from Britain could become a Roman senator, a Germanic merchant could retire wealthy in a villa overlooking the Mediterranean, and a Jewish tent maker from Asia Minor could spread his religious teachings throughout the empire's cities. This integration was neither complete nor without tensions. Roman society remained deeply stratified, with sharp distinctions between citizens and subjects, free and enslaved, urban and rural populations. The empire's prosperity depended on constant expansion to capture new sources of wealth and slaves, creating an inherent instability that became increasingly difficult to manage as geographical expansion reached natural limits. The military systems that had built the empire gradually became its greatest burden. By the 3rd century CE, the Roman army consumed approximately 75% of imperial revenues, requiring constant increases in taxation that strained the economic foundations of Roman prosperity. The very success of Roman integration created new challenges as formerly conquered peoples demanded greater participation in imperial governance while maintaining their own cultural identities. The crisis of the 3rd century, from 235 to 284 CE, saw the empire nearly collapse under the weight of civil wars, barbarian invasions, plague, and economic instability. 50 emperors claimed power during this period, most dying violent deaths within a few years of gaining the throne. The Roman currency became virtually worthless through debasement, trade networks collapsed, and entire regions reverted to subsistence agriculture as urban centres were abandoned. Yet Rome's capacity for reinvention proved as remarkable as its military prowess. The reforms of Diocletian and Constantine in the late 3rd and early 4th centuries restructured imperial administration, stabilized the currency, and created new military systems that enabled the empire to survive for another 2 centuries in the west and over 1,000 years in the east. The division of the empire between western and eastern halves reflected the practical impossibility of governing such vast territories from a single centre. The Eastern Empire, centred in Constantinople, proved more durable partly because it controlled the wealthier and more urbanised regions of the Mediterranean world, but also because it adapted more successfully to changing military, economic and cultural conditions. The Western Empire's gradual transformation in the 5th and 6th centuries involved not sudden collapse, but a complex process of political fragmentation, military devolution, and cultural change that historians now describe as transformation rather than fall. Germanic kings who had served as Roman federates gradually assumed direct control over territories they had been assigned to defend, while maintaining Roman titles, legal systems and administrative practices. The Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy, the Visigothic kingdom in Spain, and the Frankish kingdom in Gaul all considered themselves legitimate successors to Roman authority rather than foreign conquerors. They continued to use Roman law, employed Roman administrators, and maintained Roman urban institutions where these remained viable. The transformation was often so gradual that contemporaries might not have noticed when Roman rule officially ended and post-Roman rule began. The Eastern Empire, later known as the Byzantine Empire, preserved Roman identity and institutions for another millennium. Constantinople remained the largest and wealthiest city in Europe throughout the medieval period, its massive walls protecting a population that maintained classical learning, sophisticated crafts, and complex diplomatic relationships with emerging kingdoms throughout Europe and the Islamic world. Byzantine emperors continued to style themselves as Roman emperors and claimed authority over all former Roman territories, though their actual power gradually contracted to the immediate vicinity of Constantinople. The empire's survival demonstrated both the durability of Roman institutions and the adaptability required for long-term political success. Byzantine administration evolved to accommodate new military threats, new religious obligations following the adoption of Christianity, and new economic realities as Mediterranean trade patterns shifted. The final fall of Constantinople to Ottoman forces in 1453 marked the end of a political entity that had existed in continuous succession from Augustus Caesar. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, died defending the city's walls, ending a dynasty that traced its authority back over 2,000 years to the founder of the Roman Empire. Yet even as the Western Roman Empire transformed into medieval European kingdoms, the imperial idea it embodied continued to shape political development across Europe. The Holy Roman Empire, established by Charlemagne in 800 CE, explicitly claimed to restore Roman authority in Western Europe. Though it never achieved the territorial extent or administrative coherence of its ancient predecessor, the Holy Roman Empire endured until 1806, making it one of the longest-lived political entities in European history. The Holy Roman Empire's structure reflected medieval Europe's political fragmentation, while maintaining the fiction of imperial unity. Unlike the centralized administration of ancient Rome, the medieval empire functioned as a loose confederation of kingdoms, duchies, bishoprics, and free cities that recognized the emperor's theoretical supremacy while maintaining practical independence in most matters. The empire's electoral system, formalized in the Golden Bull of 1356, created a unique form of representative monarchy in which 7 princes, 3 archbishops and 4 secular rulers, chose the emperor. This system prevented the empire from becoming a hereditary monarchy, while ensuring that imperial power remained limited by the need to maintain consensus among major territorial princes. The religious dimension of medieval imperial authority differed fundamentally from Roman precedents. While Roman emperors had gradually assumed divine attributes and demanded religious veneration, Holy Roman emperors derived their legitimacy from Christian theology and papal coronation. This created ongoing tensions between imperial and papal authority that shaped European political development for centuries. The investiture controversy of the 11th and 12th centuries exemplified these tensions. The conflict between Emperor Henry IV and Pope Gregory VII over the right to appoint bishops revealed fundamental disagreements about the relationship between temporal and spiritual authority. The emperor's submission to papal authority at Canossa in 1077 demonstrated the limits of imperial power in medieval Europe. while the ultimate compromise reached in the Concordat of Worms in 1122 established principles of church-state relations that influenced European political development for centuries. The empire's greatest territorial extent was achieved under the Hohenstaufen emperors of the 12th and 13th centuries, who controlled territories from the Baltic Sea to Sicily. Frederick Barbarossa's attempts to reassert imperial authority in Italy led to decades of warfare with the Lombard League, while his grandson Frederick II's cosmopolitan court in Sicily became a centre of learning that preserved and transmitted classical knowledge to Western Europe. Yet the empire's decentralised structure, which had enabled its survival through centuries of political turmoil, ultimately prevented it from competing effectively with the emerging centralised monarchies of France, England, and Spain. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which ended the 30 Years' War, effectively reduced the Holy Roman Empire to a collection of independent states that recognised imperial authority only in ceremonial matters. While European empires traced their legitimacy to Roman precedents, very different imperial traditions were developing in other parts of the world. The Chinese Empire, established by the Qin dynasty in 221 BCE, created administrative and cultural systems that proved even more durable than Roman institutions. The concept of the mandate of heaven provided a theoretical framework for legitimate rule that transcended individual dynasties, enabling Chinese civilization to maintain political and cultural continuity through cycles of unity and fragmentation. The Han dynasty, which ruled China from 206 BCE to 220 CE, consolidated the administrative systems established by the Qin and created the cultural synthesis that defined Chinese civilization for the next 2 millennia. The Han established the examination system for selecting government officials, standardized weights and measures throughout their territories, and promoted Confucian philosophy as the ideological foundation for imperial administration. The durability of Chinese imperial institutions is demonstrated by their survival through repeated foreign conquests. The Yuan dynasty, established by Mongol conquerors in the 13th century, and the Qing dynasty, founded by Manchu invaders in the 17th century, both adopted Chinese administrative systems, cultural practices, and ideological frameworks rather than imposing their own traditions on Chinese society. The Chinese examination system created a meritocratic bureaucracy that enabled talented individuals from diverse backgrounds to participate in imperial administration. Unlike European feudal systems that reserved government positions for hereditary nobility, Chinese administration was theoretically open to anyone who could master the classical curriculum and pass the rigorous examinations required for official appointment. This system created a scholar official class that provided continuity across dynastic transitions and maintained sophisticated administrative traditions that enabled effective governance of China's vast territory and enormous population. The examination system also promoted cultural unity by requiring candidates to master a standardized curriculum based on Confucian classics, creating shared values and perspectives among educated elites throughout the empire. The Tang dynasty, 618 to 907 CE, represented perhaps the apex of Chinese imperial achievement. Tang China was the world's largest and most populous empire, controlling territories from Korea to Central Asia and maintaining diplomatic relationships with kingdoms throughout Asia, the Middle East, and even Europe. The Tang capital of Chang'an housed over 1 million inhabitants and served as the eastern terminus of the Silk Road trade network that connected Asia to the Mediterranean world. Tang cosmopolitanism rivaled that of ancient Rome. The imperial capital attracted merchants, diplomats, scholars, and artists from throughout Asia. Buddhist monasteries, Zoroastrian temples, Christian churches, and Islamic mosques operated alongside traditional Chinese religious institutions. The imperial administration employed officials from throughout Asia, while Tang armies included soldiers recruited from dozens of different ethnic groups. The Anlushan Rebellion of 755 to 763 demonstrated both the fragility and resilience of Chinese imperial institutions. The rebellion, led by a general of Central Asian origin, devastated much of northern China and reduced the Tang Empire's population by an estimated 13 million people. Yet the dynasty survived for another 150 years, and Chinese imperial institutions continued to function despite massive social and economic disruption. The Song dynasty, 960 to 1279, presided over a period of remarkable technological and economic development, despite controlling less territory than the Tang. Song China experienced what historians call a medieval economic revolution, with innovations in agriculture, manufacturing and commerce that supported a population exceeding 100 million people. The Song government was the first to issue paper money, operate a national postal system, and maintain detailed statistical records of economic activity. Song military weakness, paradoxically, may have contributed to their remarkable cultural and technological achievements. Unable to expand through conquest, the Song focused resources on internal development, education, and technological innovation. Song China led the world in metallurgy, engineering, medicine, astronomy, and mathematics, while Song philosophers created Neo-Confucian synthesis that influenced East Asian intellectual development for centuries. The Mongol conquest of China in the 13th century created the world's largest contiguous land empire, stretching from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean. The Yuan dynasty, established by Kublai Khan, represented the first successful foreign conquest of all China, yet even the Mongols found it necessary to adopt Chinese administrative systems and cultural practices to govern their vast territories effectively. Marco Polo's account of his travels in Mongol China provides fascinating glimpses of the Yuan Empire at its height. The Mongol court at Kanbalik, modern Beijing, maintained the ceremonial traditions and administrative complexity of Chinese imperial government while facilitating unprecedented levels of cultural and commercial exchange across Eurasia. The Ming dynasty, 1368 to 1644, restored native Chinese rule and presided over another period of remarkable cultural and technological achievement. The early Ming emperors launched massive naval expeditions under Admiral Zheng He that reached Southeast Asia, India, the Persian Gulf, and the eastern coast of Africa. These voyages demonstrated Chinese technological capabilities in shipbuilding, navigation, and logistics that exceeded European achievements by several centuries. The decision to discontinue these naval expeditions and focus on land-based defence against nomadic threats from the north represented one of history's great turning points. Had Chinese naval exploration continued, the age of exploration might have been led by Chinese admirals rather than European adventurers, potentially altering the entire course of world history. The Qing dynasty, established by Manchu conquest in 1644, presided over the last great expansion of Chinese territory. Under the Qing, the Chinese Empire reached its greatest territorial extent, incorporating Tibet, Xinjiang, Mongolia, and Manchuria into a unified state that controlled nearly 12 million square kilometres. The Qing also governed the world's largest population, with Chinese subjects numbering over 400 million by 1800. Yet the Qing Empire's apparent strength masked growing internal problems and external pressures that would lead to its eventual collapse. Population growth outpaced agricultural productivity, creating social tensions that erupted in massive rebellions, including the Taiping Civil War, 1850 to 1864, which killed an estimated 20 to 30 million people. European imperialism forced China to open its markets to foreign trade on unfavourable terms, draining wealth from the Chinese economy and undermining imperial authority. The Opium Wars of the mid-19th century demonstrated the technological and organisational advantages that European powers had gained over traditional Chinese military systems. The Treaty of Nanking in 1842 forced China to cede Hong Kong to Britain and opened 5 ports to foreign trade, marking the beginning of what Chinese historians call the Century of Humiliation. The collapse of the Qing dynasty in 1912 ended over 2,000 years of imperial rule in China, yet the territorial boundaries, administrative traditions, and cultural unity established by Chinese empires continue to shape modern China. The People's Republic of China, established in 1949, controls essentially the same territories as the Qing Empire, and maintains many of the same administrative and cultural systems that enabled Chinese civilization to survive through multiple dynastic cycles. While Chinese empires maintained continuity through cultural and administrative traditions, the Islamic world developed a different model of imperial organization based on religious authority and legal systems derived from Islamic law. The rapid expansion of Islamic rule in the 7th and 8th centuries created an empire that stretched from Spain to Central Asia within a century of Prophet Muhammad's death. The Umayyad Caliphate, 661 to 750, established the first great Islamic empire, with its capital in Damascus ruling over territories that encompassed most of the former Byzantine and Persian empires. the speed of Islamic conquest was remarkable. Within 50 years, Arab armies had defeated the two greatest powers of late antiquity and established control over territories that had taken Rome centuries to conquer. The success of early Islamic expansion resulted from a combination of military effectiveness, political flexibility, and religious appeal. Arab armies were highly mobile and could operate effectively in the desert regions that formed natural barriers for other military forces. The Islamic message of social equality and religious brotherhood attracted converts from diverse backgrounds, while the Islamic legal system provided a framework for governing multi-ethnic populations. The Abbasid Caliphate, 750 to 1258, moved the Islamic capital to Baghdad and presided over a golden age of Islamic civilization. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad became a centre of learning that preserved and transmitted classical knowledge from Greek, Persian and Indian sources, while sponsoring original research in mathematics, astronomy, medicine and philosophy. Abbasid prosperity was based on control of transcontinental trade routes that connected China, India, Central Asia and Europe. Baghdad's location on the Tigris River provided access to both overland caravan routes and maritime connections through the Persian Gulf. The Abbasid Empire's economic integration rivaled that of the Roman Empire, with standardized weights, measures, and coinage facilitating trade across vast distances. The fragmentation of the Abbasid Caliphate in the 9th and 10th centuries led to the emergence of independent Islamic dynasties throughout the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia. Yet these successor states maintained connections through shared religious traditions, legal systems, and commercial networks that preserved Islamic civilization's cultural unity despite political fragmentation. The Ottoman Empire, established in the 14th century, created the most successful and longest-lasting of the Islamic imperial states. From their original base in Anatolia, Ottoman rulers gradually expanded to control much of southeastern Europe, Western Asia, and northern Africa. At its height in the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire controlled territories from the Crimean Peninsula to Yemen, from Algeria to Baghdad. Ottoman success was based on military innovation, administrative flexibility, and religious tolerance. The Janissary Corps, recruited from Christian subjects and converted to Islam, provided the Ottomans with disciplined infantry forces that could effectively use firearms and artillery. The Devshirme system of recruiting talented youth from conquered populations created a loyal administrative class that could govern the empire's diverse territories effectively. The millet system allowed religious and ethnic minorities to maintain their own laws and customs, while participating in the broader Ottoman economy and administration. This tolerance enabled the Ottoman Empire to integrate diverse populations more successfully than many of its contemporaries, creating a multicultural society that included Orthodox Christians, Catholics, Jews, Arabs, Turks, Slavs, and dozens of other ethnic and religious groups. Ottoman expansion into Europe made the empire a major player in European politics for over 4 centuries. The Siege of Vienna in 1529 brought Ottoman armies to the heart of Europe, while Ottoman naval power in the Mediterranean challenged European control of key trade routes. The Battle of Lepanto in 1571 marked the beginning of Ottoman naval decline, yet the empire remained a formidable land power for another 2 centuries. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 marked the Ottoman Empire's first major territorial losses to European powers, beginning a long period of gradual retreat that would continue until the empire's dissolution after World War I. The rise of Russian power in the north, Habsburg expansion in the west, and internal rebellions throughout the empire created pressures that Ottoman institutions proved unable to manage effectively. Ottoman attempts at modernization in the 19th century, including the Tanzimat reforms and the Young Turk movement, failed to restore the empire's military effectiveness or economic competitiveness. The empire's involvement in World War I on the German side led to its complete collapse and the division of its territories among the victorious Allied powers. The Republic of Turkey, established by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk in 1923, represented a conscious rejection of imperial traditions in favour of a secular nationalist state modelled on European examples. Yet modern Turkey continues to be influenced by Ottoman administrative traditions, architectural heritage, and cultural practices that reflect 5 centuries of imperial rule. The Safavid Empire in Persia, 1501 to 1736, created another distinctive model of Islamic imperial organisation based on Shia religious identity and Persian cultural traditions. The Safavids established Shia Islam as the state religion and created a centralized administrative system that drew on both Islamic and Persian precedents. The Safavid capital of Isfahan became one of the world's most beautiful cities, with magnificent mosques, palaces, and public buildings that demonstrated the wealth and sophistication of Persian civilization. The famous saying, "Isfahan is half the world," reflected the city's role as a major center of trade, crafts, and learning that attracted visitors from throughout Asia and Europe. Safavid military power was based on the Ghulams, a slave army recruited from Georgian and Circassian populations and trained in the use of firearms and artillery. This military system enabled the Safavids to compete effectively with their Ottoman and Mughal neighbours, while maintaining control over Persia's traditionally fragmented tribal populations. The collapse of the Safavid Empire in the early 18th century was followed by a period of political fragmentation that ended with the rise of the Qajar dynasty in 1794. The Qajars ruled Persia until 1925, but never achieved the territorial extent or administrative effectiveness of their Safavid predecessors. In the Indian subcontinent, the Mughal Empire, 1526 to 1857, created perhaps the most successful synthesis of Islamic and Hindu traditions in world history. The Mughals, who traced their ancestry to both Genghis Khan and Tamerlane, established control over most of the Indian subcontinent and created a distinctive Indo-Islamic civilization that influenced art, architecture, literature and cuisine throughout South Asia. The third Mughal emperor, Akbar, 1556 to 1605, developed policies of religious tolerance and cultural synthesis that enabled effective governance of the subcontinent's religiously diverse population. Akbar's court attracted scholars, artists, and administrators from throughout the Islamic world, while incorporating Hindu traditions and personnel into imperial service. The Mughal administrative system combined Persian bureaucratic traditions with Indian revenue systems to create effective governance of a territory containing over 100 million people. The Mansabdari system created a unified military and administrative hierarchy that enabled central control of vast territories, while providing opportunities for advancement to talented individuals from diverse backgrounds. Mughal architectural achievements, including the Taj Mahal, Red Fort, and numerous mosques and palaces throughout India, represent one of the world's great architectural traditions. The distinctive Mughal style combined Persian, Central Asian and Indian elements to create buildings of extraordinary beauty and technical sophistication that continue to inspire architects and artists worldwide. The decline of Mughal power in the 18th century was accelerated by invasions from Afghanistan and Persia, internal rebellions by Hindu Maratha and Sikh forces, and the gradual expansion of British East India Company control over Indian territories. The Indian Rebellion of 1857 marked the end of meaningful Mughal authority and the beginning of direct British colonial rule. The British Empire, which emerged from the expansion of British commercial and naval power in the 17th and 18th centuries, eventually became the largest empire in world history. At its peak in the early 20th century, the British Empire controlled approximately 25% of the world's land area and governed over 400 million subjects across 6 continents. British imperial expansion was driven initially by commercial interests rather than territorial conquest. The British East India Company, established in 1600, gradually gained control over Indian territories through a combination of military force, diplomatic manipulation, and economic pressure. The company's private army eventually controlled more territory than the British government itself. The loss of the American colonies in 1783 forced Britain to reconsider its imperial strategy and focus more attention on Asian and later African territories. The acquisition of India provided Britain with the wealth and manpower to compete effectively with other European powers during the Napoleonic Wars and to expand imperial control to Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and eventually much of Africa and Southeast Asia. British imperial administration varied considerably across different territories and populations. The white settler colonies of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand were granted increasing self-government throughout the 19th century, eventually becoming independent dominions within the British Commonwealth. India was governed through a complex system that combined direct British rule with indirect control through native princes and local rulers. The British Empire's greatest achievement was probably the creation of global communication and transportation networks that connected distant territories and facilitated unprecedented levels of international trade. British shipping lines, telegraph cables, and railways created the infrastructure for the first truly global economy, while British banks and trading companies provided the financial services needed for international commerce. Yet the British Empire also represented one of history's largest exercises in cultural and economic exploitation. The extraction of wealth from colonial territories, the suppression of local industries to benefit British manufacturers, and the imposition of European legal and social systems caused enormous disruption to traditional societies throughout Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. The two world wars marked the beginning of the end for the British Empire. The enormous costs of global warfare strained British finances and revealed the empire's dependence on American support, while the principle of national self-determination, promoted by the victorious Allies, undermined the ideological foundations of imperial rule. The independence of India and Pakistan in 1947 marked the most significant step in British decolonisation, removing the jewel in the crown that had provided the wealth and strategic importance that justified Britain's global imperial role. The Suez Crisis of 1956 demonstrated Britain's reduced global influence, while the rapid decolonisation of African territories in the 1960s marked the end of Britain's role as a global imperial power. The transformation of the British Empire into the Commonwealth of Nations represented an attempt to maintain connections between Britain and its former colonies through voluntary association rather than imperial control. While the Commonwealth continues to exist, its political significance has diminished as former colonies have developed their own regional relationships and global orientations. The French Empire, established through expansion in North America, the Caribbean, Africa, and Southeast Asia, represented a different model of imperial organisation that emphasised cultural assimilation and direct administration. Unlike the British preference for indirect rule, French colonial policy sought to transform colonial subjects into French citizens through education, conversion to Christianity, and adoption of French cultural values. French expansion in North America created a vast territorial empire that stretched from Quebec to Louisiana and included much of the Great Lakes region and Mississippi River Valley. Yet French colonial settlement remained sparse compared to British territories, limiting France's ability to maintain effective control over these vast territories. The loss of most French territories in North America following the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, forced France to focus imperial expansion on other regions. The conquest of Algeria in the 1830s began a new phase of French expansion in Africa that eventually created the second largest European empire after Britain. French rule in Africa emphasised direct administration through French-educated African clerks and officials who served as intermediaries between colonial administrators and local populations. The policy of assimilation offered colonial subjects the possibility of becoming French citizens through education and cultural transformation, though relatively few Africans were able to meet the stringent requirements for citizenship. The French Empire's cultural influence often exceeded its political importance. French became the language of international diplomacy and intellectual discourse, while French educational systems and legal codes were adopted throughout much of Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. The Alliance Française and other cultural institutions continue to promote French language and culture worldwide. French decolonisation following World War II was often more violent and protracted than British withdrawal from empire. The wars in Indochina, 1946 to 1954, and Algeria, 1954 to 1962, demonstrated France's reluctance to abandon imperial control and the costs of attempting to maintain empire through military force against determined independence movements. The Spanish Empire, established through the conquest of the Americas in the 16th century, was the first truly global empire and provided the model for European colonial expansion that would be followed by other powers for the next 4 centuries. Spanish control of American silver mines provided the wealth that funded European warfare and commerce for over 2 centuries. Spanish colonial administration in the Americas was highly centralized and bureaucratic, with elaborate systems of territorial division, legal codes, and administrative hierarchies that governed territories from California to Chile. The encomienda and later hacienda systems created agricultural and mining enterprises that extracted enormous wealth from American territories while exploiting indigenous and enslaved African labor. The Spanish Empire's cultural legacy in the Americas was profound and lasting. Spanish language, Catholic Christianity and European legal systems were imposed throughout Spanish territories, creating cultural unity across vast distances that persist today. The mixing of Spanish, indigenous, and African populations created distinctive mestizo societies that combined elements from multiple cultural traditions. Spanish imperial decline began in the 17th century as American silver production decreased, and other European powers challenged Spanish control of international trade. The War of Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, resulted in territorial losses in Europe and the opening of Spanish-American markets to British traders, undermining the monopolistic commercial system that had supported Spanish prosperity. The independence movements that swept Spanish America in the early 19th century, led by figures like Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín, ended Spanish control over most American territories. By 1825, Spain retained only Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines from its vast American empire. The Spanish-American War of 1898 marked the end of the Spanish Empire as a global power. The loss of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines to the United States reduced Spain to a European regional power, though Spanish cultural influence in Latin America remained strong through language, religion, and educational institutions. The Portuguese Empire, established through maritime exploration and commercial expansion in the 15th and 16th centuries, created the longest-lasting European imperial presence outside Europe. Portuguese control of Brazil lasted over 300 years, while Portuguese territories in Africa remained under colonial rule until the 1970s. Portuguese expansion was driven primarily by the search for direct access to Asian spice markets and African gold sources. Vasco da Gama's voyage to India in 1498 established Portuguese control over key points along the Indian Ocean trade routes, while the establishment of trading posts and fortresses created a network of commercial bases that extended from Brazil to Japan. Unlike Spanish territorial conquest in the Americas, Portuguese expansion initially focused on establishing coastal trading posts and controlling maritime commerce rather than conquering large inland territories. This strategy was effective in Asia, where Portuguese merchants could operate within existing commercial networks, but proved less successful in Africa and the Americas, where territorial control was necessary for economic exploitation. The union of Portuguese and Spanish crowns from 1580 to 1640 led to conflicts with Dutch and English merchants, who attacked Portuguese territories as part of their broader struggle against Spanish power. The Dutch conquest of many Portuguese Asian territories during this period permanently reduced Portuguese influence in Asia. Brazilian independence in 1822 removed Portugal's largest and wealthiest territory, reducing the Portuguese Empire to African holdings that provided relatively limited economic benefits. Portuguese resistance to decolonization in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau during the 1960s and 1970s led to prolonged wars that drained Portuguese resources and contributed to political instability within Portugal itself. The Dutch Empire was built primarily on commercial rather than territorial foundations, with the Dutch East India Company and Dutch West India Company establishing trading networks that connected Europe to markets throughout Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Dutch commercial techniques, including joint stock companies, maritime insurance, and banking systems, provided models for capitalist development that influenced economic organization worldwide. Dutch control of the Indonesian archipelago represented the most successful and lasting component of the Dutch Empire. The Dutch East India Company established effective control over Indonesian trade through a combination of military force, diplomatic manipulation, and economic pressure that gradually extended Dutch authority over most of the region. The Dutch colonial system in Indonesia emphasized economic exploitation rather than territorial administration or cultural assimilation. The culture system introduced in 1830 required Indonesian farmers to devote 1/5 of their land to export crops that were sold exclusively to the Dutch government at fixed prices, generating enormous revenues for the Netherlands while impoverishing Indonesian agriculture. Dutch decolonization was complicated by the valuable economic resources of Indonesia and the strategic importance of Indonesian territories during World War II. The Japanese occupation of Indonesia during the war weakened Dutch control and enabled Indonesian independence movements to organize resistance to the restoration of Dutch rule. The Indonesian War of Independence, 1945 to 1949, ended with Dutch recognition of Indonesian sovereignty, though the Netherlands retained control of Western New Guinea until 1962. The loss of Indonesia marked the end of the Dutch Empire as a significant global power, though the Netherlands maintained smaller territories in the Caribbean that continued to be associated with the Dutch government. The German Empire, established relatively late in the age of European imperialism, never achieved the territorial extent or economic importance of British, French or Spanish colonial holdings. German unification in 1871 occurred after the best colonial territories had already been claimed by other European powers, forcing Germany to compete for less desirable territories in Africa and the Pacific. German colonial administration in Africa was often brutal and exploitative, leading to resistance movements that were suppressed with extreme violence. The Herero and Namaqua genocide in German Southwest Africa, 1904 to 1908, represented one of the first genocidal campaigns of the 20th century and demonstrated the potential for colonial violence that would later characterize Nazi policies in Eastern Europe. German participation in World War I led to the loss of all German colonial territories, which were distributed among the victorious Allied powers as League of Nations mandates. The brief duration of German colonial rule limited its long-term cultural impact, though German missionaries, scholars and administrators made significant contributions to African linguistics, anthropology and geography. The attempt to establish a Nazi empire in Eastern Europe during World War II represented a different and more radical form of imperialism based on racial ideology and systematic extermination of conquered populations. Unlike traditional colonial empires that sought to exploit local labour and resources, Nazi expansion aimed to eliminate existing populations and replace them with German settlers. The failure of Nazi expansion demonstrated the limits of imperial power in the modern era and contributed to the general delegitimization of imperial ideologies that accelerated decolonization after World War II. The association of imperialism with racism and genocide made it increasingly difficult for European powers to justify continued colonial rule. The Japanese Empire, established through expansion in East Asia beginning in the late 19th century, represented the first successful challenge to European imperial dominance by a non-European power. Japanese modernization during the Meiji period, 1868 to 1912, enabled Japan to adopt European military, industrial and administrative techniques while maintaining Japanese cultural identity. The Russo-Japanese War, 1904 to 1905, demonstrated Japanese military capabilities and established Japan as a major regional power. Japanese victory over a European power inspired independence movements throughout Asia and Africa, while forcing European powers to recognize Japan as an equal participant in international politics. Japanese expansion into Manchuria, China, and Southeast Asia during the 1930s and 1940s was justified through Pan-Asian ideology that promised to liberate Asian peoples from European colonial rule. While Japanese rule often proved more exploitative than European colonialism, the temporary elimination of European power in much of Asia accelerated independence movements that succeeded in achieving decolonization after World War II. The American defeat of Japan in 1945 ended the Japanese Empire but demonstrated American emergence as the dominant global power. American occupation of Japan and support for decolonization throughout Asia and Africa represented a new form of international influence that emphasized economic and political relationships rather than direct territorial control. The Soviet Union represented perhaps the last great territorial empire, controlling over 22 million square kilometers and governing over 280 million people from dozens of different ethnic and linguistic groups. Unlike maritime empires that were separated by oceans from their colonial territories, the Soviet Empire consisted of contiguous territories that had been incorporated into the Russian Empire through centuries of expansion. Soviet imperial ideology differed from earlier forms of imperialism by emphasizing class solidarity rather than ethnic or national identity. The promise of socialist development and eventual equality among all Soviet peoples provided a theoretical framework for governing multi-ethnic populations while maintaining centralized political control. The reality of Soviet rule often contradicted official ideology, as Russian cultural dominance, economic exploitation of peripheral regions, and political suppression of local nationalisms created tensions that contributed to the empire's eventual collapse. The deportation of entire ethnic groups during and after World War II demonstrated the Soviet state's willingness to use extreme violence to maintain political control over its diverse populations. Soviet economic policy treated the empire's peripheral regions as sources of raw materials and agricultural products for industrial centres located primarily in Russia. Central Asian republics were forced to specialise in cotton production, Baltic states provided manufactured goods, and Siberian regions supplied timber, minerals and energy resources. This colonial-style economic relationship created dependencies that made independence difficult, even after political control weakened. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked the end of the last great territorial empire and completed the process of decolonization that had begun after World War II. The independence of 15 Soviet republics demonstrated that even the most centralized and militarily powerful empires remained vulnerable to the forces of nationalism and economic change that had destroyed earlier imperial systems. Yet the patterns established by 2 millennia of imperial rule continue to influence contemporary international relations. The borders drawn by imperial administrators, the languages spread by imperial conquest, and the economic relationships established by imperial trade networks remain visible in modern political and cultural geography. The emergence of the United States as a global superpower after World War II represented a new form of international influence that avoided direct territorial control while maintaining economic and political dominance over much of the world. American military bases, economic aid programs, and cultural exports created informal imperial relationships that influenced global development without the administrative burdens of traditional colonial rule. The American model of hegemonic influence has been emulated by other contemporary powers, including China's Belt and Road Initiative and Russia's efforts to maintain influence over former Soviet territories. These modern forms of imperial influence demonstrate that the fundamental drive to extend power and control over distant territories and populations continues to shape international relations, despite the formal end of the imperial age. The persistence of imperial patterns in contemporary politics suggests that empires represent more than historical curiosities. They embody fundamental aspects of human political organization that transcend specific cultural or technological contexts. The challenge of governing large, diverse populations across vast territories remains as relevant today as it was for Roman emperors or Chinese dynasties. Understanding the rise and fall of world empires provides crucial insights into the dynamics of political power, economic organization, and cultural change that continue to influence contemporary global development. The achievements and failures of imperial systems offer both inspiration and cautionary tales for modern efforts to create international cooperation and manage global challenges. The Roman Empire's integration of diverse populations through law and citizenship, the Chinese Empire's meritocratic administration and cultural synthesis, the Islamic Empire's religious tolerance and commercial networks, and the British Empire's global communication systems all represent successful solutions to persistent problems of political organisation and economic coordination. Yet the same imperial systems that achieved remarkable feats of administration and cultural development also demonstrated the potential for exploitation, violence, and cultural destruction that accompanies concentrated political power. The Spanish conquest of the Americas, the Atlantic slave trade, the Opium Wars in China, and the colonial famines in India all illustrate the human costs of imperial expansion and rule. The technological and organizational innovations developed by empires often outlasted the political systems that created them. Roman law, Chinese examination systems, Islamic banking practices, and European industrial techniques continued to influence global development long after the empires that created them had disappeared. Perhaps most importantly, the study of world empires reveals the temporary nature of all political arrangements and the constant need for adaptation and reform in human societies. Even the most powerful and sophisticated empires eventually succumb to changes in technology, environment, economy, or ideology that their existing institutions could not accommodate. The cyclical patterns of imperial rise and fall, expansion followed by overextension, prosperity followed by fiscal crisis, cultural synthesis followed by fragmentation, suggest that human societies face recurring challenges that require constant vigilance and adaptation. The specific solutions developed by different empires varied enormously, but the underlying problems of maintaining political unity, economic prosperity, and cultural coherence across large territories and diverse populations remain fundamentally similar. The American Empire, though it has avoided formal territorial acquisition, faces many of the same challenges that confronted previous imperial powers. The costs of maintaining global military commitments, the difficulties of managing relationships with diverse allies and clients, and the tensions between imperial responsibilities and domestic priorities all echo patterns familiar from earlier imperial experiences. China's emergence as a potential rival to American global dominance has revived questions about imperial competition and the possibility of conflict between rising and declining powers. The historical precedents of British-German rivalry before World War I and the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta suggest that such transitions can be extremely dangerous for international stability. Yet the contemporary international system also differs fundamentally from earlier imperial ages in ways that may reduce the likelihood of direct military conflict between major powers. Nuclear weapons, economic interdependence, international institutions, and global communication networks create constraints and opportunities that did not exist for previous imperial systems. The European Union represents an entirely new form of political organisation that attempts to achieve the benefits of large-scale political and economic coordination without the hierarchical control characteristic of traditional empires. The EU's emphasis on voluntary cooperation, democratic governance, and respect for national sovereignty offers a potential alternative to imperial models of organising international relationships. However, the recent challenges facing the European Union, including Brexit, the Eurozone crisis, and disagreements over immigration and sovereignty, demonstrate the continuing difficulties of maintaining political unity across culturally diverse territories, even when coercion is explicitly rejected in favour of consensus and cooperation. The persistence of ethnic conflict, religious extremism, and territorial disputes in many parts of the world suggest that the forces that drove imperial expansion and resistance to imperial rule remain active in contemporary politics. The breakup of Yugoslavia, the conflicts in the Middle East, and the tensions over territorial claims in Asia all reflect continuing struggles over the political organisation of culturally diverse populations. Environmental challenges, technological change, and economic globalization are creating new forms of interdependence that may require new approaches to international governance. Climate change, pandemic disease, financial crises, and cybersecurity threats all transcend national boundaries and require coordinated responses that existing international institutions are often unable to provide effectively. The study of historical empires may provide useful insights for addressing these contemporary challenges. The administrative techniques, legal systems, and cultural policies developed by successful empires offer models for managing diversity and maintaining stability across large territories and diverse populations. At the same time, the failures of imperial systems provide important warnings about the dangers of concentrated power, cultural arrogance, and economic exploitation. The rebellions, civil wars, and collapses that mark the end of most empires demonstrate the importance of maintaining legitimacy, adaptability, and responsiveness to changing conditions. The technological capabilities available to contemporary governments far exceed those of any historical empire, yet the fundamental challenges of political organisation remain remarkably similar. The need to balance central coordination with local autonomy, to maintain economic prosperity while ensuring equitable distribution of benefits, and to preserve cultural diversity while promoting social cohesion continues to challenge political leaders worldwide. The information revolution has created new possibilities for political organisation and citizen participation that may enable more responsive and accountable forms of governance than were possible in earlier eras. Digital communication, data analysis, and artificial intelligence offer tools for understanding and responding to citizen needs that could potentially address some of the problems that contributed to imperial collapse. Yet the same technologies also create new vulnerabilities and new forms of inequality that may prove as destabilizing as the challenges that confronted historical empires. Cyber warfare, information manipulation, and technological unemployment all represent threats that existing political institutions are struggling to address effectively. The emergence of global cities that maintain stronger connections to other global cities than to their surrounding national territories suggests that traditional territorial models of political organisation may be becoming obsolete. The concentration of economic activity, cultural production, and political influence in a few dozen major metropolitan areas creates new patterns of inequality and new challenges for democratic governance. Corporate power has achieved a global reach and influence that rivals, or exceeds that of many national governments, creating informal imperial relationships based on economic control rather than political authority. The ability of multinational corporations to move production, avoid taxation, and influence government policy demonstrates that non-state actors can exercise imperial-like power without formal political responsibility. The growth of international criminal organizations, terrorist networks, and other non-state actors that operate across national boundaries represents another challenge to traditional models of territorial governance. These organizations often demonstrate more adaptability and effectiveness than formal government institutions, suggesting that alternative forms of political organization may be emerging outside existing legal frameworks. Religious movements that transcend national boundaries and claim universal authority represent another contemporary parallel to historical imperial systems. The global reach of evangelical Christianity, political Islam, and other transnational religious movements creates loyalties and obligations that can conflict with national citizenship and democratic governance. The role of international financial institutions in shaping government policies through lending conditions and economic pressure represents a form of imperial influence that operates through market mechanisms rather than political control. The International Monetary Fund, World Bank, and other international economic institutions can effectively dictate domestic policies to debtor nations in ways that resemble traditional imperial relationships. Migration patterns driven by economic opportunity, political persecution, and environmental change are creating new forms of cultural diversity within national boundaries that challenge traditional models of citizenship and political participation. The management of these diverse populations requires skills and approaches that historical empires developed through centuries of experience governing multi-ethnic territories. The persistence of imperial patterns in contemporary international relations suggests that the fundamental human drives toward expansion, domination, and control that motivated historical empires remain active in modern politics. Understanding these drives and their consequences may be essential for developing more peaceful and sustainable approaches to international cooperation. The study of world empires ultimately reveals both the remarkable achievements and the tragic limitations of human political organization. The capacity of human societies to create institutions capable of governing hundreds of millions of people across vast territories represents one of our species' greatest accomplishments. Yet the tendency of these same institutions to become corrupt, oppressive, and ultimately self-destructive demonstrates the continuing challenges of political development. As we face contemporary challenges that require unprecedented levels of international cooperation, from climate change and pandemic disease to nuclear proliferation and artificial intelligence, the experiences of historical empires provide both inspiration and cautionary guidance for creating more effective and sustainable forms of global governance. The night grows deeper, and in the quiet darkness, we can sense the continuing influence of these vast human experiments in power and organization. The borders on our maps, the languages we speak, the laws that govern our societies, and the economic systems that shape our daily lives all bear the imprint of imperial decisions made centuries or millennia ago. The Roman roads that still carry European traffic, the Great Wall of China that remains a symbol of human ambition and limitation, the Islamic architectural monuments that grace cities from Spain to Indonesia, and the colonial buildings that house contemporary governments all remind us that imperial legacies continue to shape our physical and cultural environments. Yet the most important legacy of world empires may be the knowledge they provide about the possibilities and pitfalls of human political organization. Their successes demonstrate that human societies can achieve remarkable feats of coordination, integration, and cultural achievement when properly organized and motivated. Their failures warn us about the dangers of unchecked power, cultural arrogance, and the tendency of all human institutions to decay over time. The patterns that emerge from 2,000 years of imperial history, the cycles of expansion and contraction, the tensions between central control and local autonomy, the challenges of managing cultural diversity, and the ultimate impermanence of all political arrangements provide essential insights for understanding contemporary political development and planning for future challenges. In the end, the story of world empires is the story of humanity's ongoing struggle to create political institutions capable of promoting prosperity, security, and cultural development while respecting human dignity and maintaining adaptability to changing conditions. This struggle continues today in new forms and contexts, but the fundamental challenges remain remarkably similar to those faced by Roman emperors, Chinese dynasties, Islamic caliphs, and European colonial administrators. As consciousness gradually yields to sleep and dreams, we carry with us the knowledge that we are participants in this continuing human experiment in political organisation. The decisions we make about governance, citizenship, and international cooperation will influence the development of future political institutions, just as the decisions of past imperial rulers continue to shape our contemporary world. The empires we have explored tonight, from Rome's legal innovations to China's administrative excellence, from Islam's commercial networks to Britain's global communications, from America's informal hegemony to the Soviet Union's ideological experiment, all represent attempts to solve the eternal human problem of organising large, diverse societies in ways that promote both individual flourishing and collective welfare. Their varying degrees of success and failure provide a vast laboratory of political experience that remains relevant for contemporary challenges. The techniques they developed for managing diversity, coordinating economic activity, maintaining military security, and promoting cultural development continue to influence political thought and practice worldwide. Yet their ultimate impermanence reminds us that no political arrangement, however successful or well established, can survive indefinitely without constant adaptation and renewal. The empires that endured longest were those that maintained the capacity to evolve and respond to changing conditions, while those that became rigid or complacent quickly succumbed to internal decay or external pressure. The contemporary international system faces challenges that may require new forms of political organisation that transcend the nation-state system that emerged from the collapse of formal empires. Global problems require global solutions, yet the development of effective international institutions remains constrained by the same fundamental tensions between central authority and local autonomy that challenged historical empires. Perhaps the most valuable lesson from the study of world empires is the recognition that human political development is an ongoing process rather than a destination. Each generation must grapple anew with the fundamental challenges of political organisation, drawing on the wisdom of past experience while adapting to new circumstances and opportunities. The empires of the past achieved remarkable things within the constraints of their times and technologies. The empires of the future, whether formal or informal, territorial or networked, national or global, will face similar challenges with different tools and opportunities. Their success will depend on their ability to learn from historical experience while remaining flexible enough to address unprecedented challenges. Rest now in the knowledge that you are part of this continuing human story of political development and institutional innovation. The empires we have explored tonight represent just one chapter in the ongoing effort to create more effective, just, and sustainable forms of human organisation. Sleep well, knowing that tomorrow will bring new opportunities to contribute to this eternal human project of building better institutions and more effective forms of cooperation. The story of world empires is ultimately the story of human ambition, creativity, and the endless quest to create political arrangements worthy of our highest aspirations and capable of addressing our most pressing challenges. In dreams, perhaps we can visit the great capitals of vanished empires, walk through the halls where momentous decisions were made, and understand something of the hopes, fears, and ambitions that motivated the builders of these vast human enterprises. Their achievements inspire us, their failures instruct us, and their persistent influence reminds us that we remain connected across the centuries to all those who have struggled with the eternal challenges of human governance and cooperation. The scale and complexity of these imperial achievements become even more remarkable when examined in precise detail. The Roman Empire at its peak encompassed 5.9 million square kilometres and governed an estimated 65 million people through an administrative system that included 44 provinces, each with its own governor, legal system, and tax collection apparatus. The empire maintained 85,000 kilometres of paved roads, connecting over 350 major cities and thousands of smaller settlements across 3 continents. Roman engineering capabilities were demonstrated in projects like the Pantheon in Rome, whose concrete dome remained the world's largest unreinforced concrete structure for over 1,300 years. The building techniques used in its construction, including the systematic reduction of aggregate density from bottom to top and the precise calculation of compression forces, weren't fully understood by modern engineers until the 20th century. The Roman postal system, the cursus publicus, maintained over 1,500 way stations across the empire, enabling imperial messages to travel from Britain to Syria in approximately 40 days. This communication network required an estimated 300,000 horses and mules, maintained in carefully managed relay stations that provided fresh mounts every 12 to 15 Roman miles. Roman urban planning created cities with populations exceeding 100,000 inhabitants, while maintaining sanitary conditions that wouldn't be matched again until the 19th century. The city of Rome itself required 1.35 billion litres of water daily, delivered through 11 aqueduct systems with a combined length of 500 kilometres. The Aqua Claudia alone carried water 69 kilometres from mountain springs, maintaining a gradient of just 2 metres per kilometre across its entire length. The economic integration achieved by the Roman Empire is documented through archaeological analysis of amphorae, the standardised ceramic containers used for shipping wine, oil and other commodities. Over 25 million amphora sherds have been catalogued from sites throughout the former empire, revealing trade networks that moved Spanish olive oil to Britain, Gallic wine to Egypt, and North African grain to Rome. Roman taxation systems extracted an estimated 10 to 15% of gross domestic product from provincial territories, funding military forces that totalled approximately 450,000 soldiers and support personnel at the empire's peak. The legionary system required each soldier to carry 27 kilograms of equipment, while maintaining march rates of 30 kilometers per day, enabling rapid deployment across the empire's vast frontiers. The Chinese Empire developed even more sophisticated administrative systems that governed territories exceeding 9.5 million square kilometers and populations that reached 60 million during the Han Dynasty. The imperial examination system, established during the Han period and refined over subsequent centuries, tested candidates on a curriculum comprising approximately 400,000 Chinese characters contained in classical texts, including the Analects, Mencius, and 5 classics. The Grand Canal system, constructed over multiple dynasties and reaching its final form during the Ming period, extended 1,776 kilometers from Beijing to Hangzhou and included 2,500 locks that managed elevation changes totaling 42 meters. The canal transported 2.85 million tons of grain annually during peak operations, requiring a workforce of over 47,000 boatmen and maintenance personnel. Chinese agricultural productivity during the Song dynasty supported population levels exceeding 100 million people through innovations including new rice varieties that enabled double cropping, iron ploughs that could work heavy clay soils, and systematic crop rotation using nitrogen-fixing legumes. Song China produced approximately 125,000 tons of iron annually, more than Britain would produce until 1700. The Mongol Empire created the largest contiguous land empire in history, covering 24 million square kilometers at its peak in 1279. Mongol military organization enabled armies to travel 180 kilometers per day through the Yam relay system, which maintained 50,000 horses across 1,400 stations spanning from Hungary to Korea. Mongol administrative records, preserved in Persian, Chinese and Latin sources, document tribute payments totaling millions of silver taels annually from conquered territories. The empire's tax farming system generated revenues that supported armies exceeding 150,000 mounted warriors, while maintaining diplomatic relationships with kingdoms from Japan to Western Europe. The Islamic caliphates developed commercial networks that connected Spain to Central Asia through standardized currency systems and commercial law codes. The Abbasid gold dinar maintained consistent weight and purity standards across territories spanning 13.5 million square kilometers, facilitating trade transactions valued at millions of dinars annually. Islamic architectural achievements included the construction of Baghdad as a planned city with a diameter of 2.6 kilometers, surrounded by walls containing 360 towers, and housing an estimated 1 to 2 million inhabitants. The city's round design, with the Caliph's palace at the centre and residential districts arranged in concentric rings, represented advanced urban planning concepts that influenced city design throughout the Islamic world. The Ottoman Empire's administrative efficiency is documented through the detailed records of the imperial treasury, which tracked revenues from territories spanning 3 continents. Ottoman tax registers from the 16th century record over 20 million subjects organised into 250 administrative districts, each contributing specific quotas of soldiers, taxes, and materials to the imperial government. The Devshirme system annually recruited approximately 3,000 Christian boys for conversion to Islam and training in imperial service. These recruits underwent 7 to 14 years of education and military training before appointment to positions throughout the imperial administration, creating a meritocratic bureaucracy that enabled effective governance of culturally diverse territories. Ottoman military technology included the world's largest cannons, with some weighing over 18 tons and capable of firing stone balls weighing 600 kilograms. The Siege of Constantinople in 1453 employed 69 cannons that fired continuously for 53 days, demonstrating the empire's advanced metallurgical capabilities. The British Empire's global reach was facilitated by the world's largest merchant marine, comprising over 21,000 ships by 1850, with total tonnage exceeding 4 million tons. The Royal Navy maintained 146 major warships and 350 smaller vessels, protecting trade routes that carried goods valued at over £200 million annually. British colonial administration in India employed approximately 1,000 European officials to govern a population of 200 million people through indirect rule systems that incorporated over 560 princely states. The Indian Civil Service examination system, established in 1853, required candidates to master curricula including law, history, mathematics, natural sciences, and classical languages. The construction of Indian railways between 1850 and 1900 created a network of 40,000 kilometres that enabled the transportation of 100 million passengers and 50 million tonnes of freight annually. Railway construction employed over 500,000 workers and required the investment of approximately £350 million, representing one of history's largest infrastructure projects. British telegraph systems connected London to Calcutta through lines totalling 180,000 kilometres, enabling message transmission across the empire in hours rather than months. The All-Red Line submarine cable system, completed in 1902, provided direct communication between Britain and its Pacific territories through cables exceeding 30,000 kilometres in length. The French Empire developed different administrative approaches that emphasised direct rule and cultural assimilation. French colonial education systems in West Africa established over 2,000 schools that taught French language and culture to approximately 50,000 students annually. The Evalué system created a class of French-educated Africans who served as intermediaries between colonial administrators and local populations. French colonial economic policies transformed agricultural production in territories like Algeria and Indochina. Algerian wine production increased from 500,000 hectolitres in 1870 to over 20 million hectolitres by 1930, while Vietnamese rubber plantations employed over 100,000 workers and produced 60,000 tonnes of rubber annually by 1940. The Spanish Empire's American territories produced an estimated 150,000 tonnes of silver between 1500 and 1800, representing approximately 80% of global silver production during this period. Spanish colonial administration divided American territories into 2 viceroyalties that governed populations exceeding 15 million people through complex bureaucratic systems employing thousands of officials. Spanish colonial cities followed standardized planning principles established in the laws of the Indies, which specified precise measurements for central plazas, 100 varas square, street widths, 12 varas, and building heights, maximum 2 stories. Over 200 Spanish colonial cities were built according to these specifications, creating urban landscapes that remain recognizable today. The Portuguese Empire's maritime networks connected Lisbon to territories in Brazil, Africa, India, and China through shipping routes totaling over 40,000 nautical miles. Portuguese trading posts and fortresses, numbering over 100 major installations, controlled key points along African and Asian coasts that generated annual revenues exceeding 2 million cruzados. Portuguese colonial sugar production in Brazil employed over 120,000 enslaved workers by 1600, producing approximately 15,000 tons of sugar annually for export to European markets. The complex plantation systems developed in Brazil influenced agricultural organisation throughout the Americas. The Dutch Empire's commercial focus generated extraordinary profits through the Dutch East India Company, which paid annual dividends averaging 18% for over 200 years. The company's Asian operations employed over 25,000 European personnel and controlled territories producing spices valued at millions of guilders annually. Dutch innovations in maritime technology included the Vloot ship design, which reduced construction costs by 50% while increasing cargo capacity by 30%. These vessels enabled Dutch merchants to dominate European carrying trade and compete effectively with larger imperial powers. The German Empire's brief colonial period in Africa involved the administration of territories totaling 2.6 million square kilometres and populations exceeding 14 million people. German colonial economic policies emphasised the production of export crops, with East African territories producing 25,000 tonnes of cotton and 15,000 tonnes of sisal annually by 1913. German colonial administration employed scientific methods including detailed ethnographic studies, linguistic documentation, and systematic cartographic surveys that produced maps and records of unprecedented accuracy. German scientists and administrators compiled vocabularies of over 100 African languages and dialects. The Japanese Empire's rapid expansion between 1894 and 1942 brought territories totaling 7.4 million square kilometres and populations exceeding 500 million people under Japanese control. Japanese colonial administration in Korea and Manchuria invested heavily in infrastructure development, constructing 6,000 kilometres of railways and establishing industrial complexes, producing 2 million tonnes of steel annually. Japanese military efficiency during World War II enabled the conquest of territories from the Aleutian Islands to the Solomon Islands within 6 months, demonstrating logistical capabilities that supported operations across 16,000 kilometres of ocean. Japanese naval forces included 10 aircraft carriers and 350 combat aircraft that achieved temporary control over much of the Pacific Ocean. The Soviet Empire's internal structure encompassed 15 Union republics, 20 autonomous republics, and 8 autonomous regions governing populations speaking over 130 different languages. Soviet economic planning coordinated industrial production across 11 time zones, with 5-year plans that specified production targets for over 200,000 different products. Soviet military capabilities included armed forces totaling 5.3 million personnel at peak strength, supported by 63,000 tanks and 42,000 aircraft. The Soviet nuclear arsenal reached approximately 45,000 warheads by 1986, representing the largest accumulation of destructive power in human history. These precise measurements of imperial scale and complexity demonstrate the extraordinary organizational capabilities that human societies developed for governing vast territories and diverse populations. The administrative systems, military technologies, and economic networks created by these empires represent some of humanity's greatest achievements in political organization. Yet the same detailed records that document imperial achievements also reveal the enormous human costs of imperial expansion and rule. Roman conquest of Gaul resulted in an estimated 1 million deaths and 1 million enslaved prisoners. The Spanish conquest of the Americas led to population declines of 90% in many regions through disease, warfare, and exploitation. British colonial famines in India killed an estimated 12 to 29 million people during the late 19th century, while Leopold II's administration of the Congo Free State reduced the region's population by an estimated 10 million people between 1885 and 1895-1908. These statistics provide sobering context for evaluating the human consequences of imperial policies. The demographic data collected by imperial administrators enables detailed analysis of population changes under colonial rule. British census records from India document population growth from 255 million in 1881 to 318 million in 1921, while simultaneously recording recurring famines that killed millions. These records reveal the complex relationships between imperial economic policies and local welfare. Economic statistics from colonial territories demonstrate both the wealth extraction and infrastructure development that characterized imperial rule. British investments in Indian railways totaled £372 million by 1914, while colonial revenues exceeded £70 million annually. However, the ratio of investment to revenue extraction varied dramatically across different territories and time periods. The technological innovations developed for imperial administration often had broader applications that influenced global development. Telegraph systems built to serve imperial communication needs later became the foundation for international telecommunications. Railway networks constructed for colonial resource extraction provided infrastructure for post-independence economic development. Military technologies developed for imperial expansion, and defence contributed to rapid advances in metallurgy, engineering, and logistics that had civilian applications. The organisational systems created to manage imperial bureaucracies influenced the development of modern corporate management and governmental administration. Cultural policies implemented in colonial territories produced complex legacies that continue to influence contemporary societies. British educational systems in India created English-speaking elites who later led independence movements. French cultural policies in West Africa produced generations of French-educated intellectuals who became prominent in African politics and literature. The legal systems imposed by imperial powers often displaced traditional law codes and social practices, creating ongoing tensions in post-colonial societies. The persistence of English common law, French civil law, and Spanish legal traditions in former colonies demonstrates the lasting influence of imperial institutions. Urban planning principles developed in imperial capitals influenced city design worldwide. Haussmann's renovation of Paris during the Second Empire provided models for urban development that were adopted in colonial cities from Saigon to Algiers. British colonial hill stations in India influenced suburban development patterns that spread throughout Asia. Archaeological evidence from imperial sites provides increasingly detailed information about daily life in imperial societies. Excavations at Pompeii have revealed the commercial networks, social relationships, and cultural practices of a Roman provincial city. Similar archaeological research at colonial sites throughout Africa, Asia, and the Americas is revealing the material culture of imperial administration. Environmental consequences of imperial policies often exceeded their immediate political and economic effects. Colonial plantation agriculture transformed landscapes throughout the tropical world, replacing indigenous forests with monoculture crops that altered soil chemistry, water cycles, and biodiversity. These environmental changes continue to influence contemporary agricultural productivity and climate patterns. The linguistic legacies of imperial expansion are preserved in contemporary language distributions that reflect patterns of imperial conquest and colonization. English, Spanish, French, Portuguese, and Arabic serve as official languages in countries throughout Africa, Asia, and the Americas due to imperial influence. These linguistic patterns continue to shape education, commerce, and cultural development. Religious transformations accompanying imperial expansion created new forms of syncretism that blended imperial and indigenous traditions. Christianity in Latin America incorporated indigenous symbols and practices, while Islam in Southeast Asia adapted to local customs and beliefs. These syncretic traditions represent creative responses to imperial cultural pressures. The demographic mixing that occurred under imperial rule created new ethnic and cultural identities that persist in contemporary populations. Mestizo populations in Latin America, Eurasian communities in Asia, and Creole societies in the Caribbean all represent the complex human legacies of imperial encounter and interaction. Contemporary genetic research is providing new insights into the demographic consequences of imperial expansion. DNA analysis of modern populations reveals the extent of genetic mixing that occurred during imperial periods, while also documenting the demographic catastrophes that accompanied European colonization of the Americas and Oceania. The financial systems developed to support imperial expansion created the foundations for modern international banking and investment. The Dutch East India Company's joint stock structure provided models for corporate organization, while British colonial banking systems established international financial networks that continue to influence global commerce. Insurance systems developed to manage the risks of long-distance trade, and imperial ventures created new approaches to risk assessment and financial planning that influenced the development of modern insurance industries. Lloyd's of London, established to insure ships and cargoes in imperial trade, became a model for insurance markets worldwide. The statistical methods developed to manage imperial territories contributed to the emergence of modern social sciences. Colonial censuses, economic surveys, and administrative records created databases that enabled new forms of social analysis and governmental planning. Educational institutions established in imperial capitals and colonial territories created new networks of scholarly exchange that influenced intellectual development worldwide. Universities in London, Paris, and other imperial centres attracted students from throughout their empires, while colonial colleges trained local elites who later became leaders in independence movements. Medical knowledge developed through imperial encounters with tropical diseases contributed to advances in epidemiology, pharmacology, and public health that benefited populations worldwide. The study of malaria, yellow fever, and other tropical diseases in colonial contexts led to medical breakthroughs that saved millions of lives. Botanical gardens and zoological collections assembled by imperial researchers preserved species and varieties that might otherwise have been lost to extinction. The global exchange of plants and animals that accompanied imperial expansion created new agricultural possibilities, while also introducing invasive species that disrupted local ecosystems. The cartographic projects undertaken to map imperial territories created geographical knowledge that remains essential for contemporary navigation, resource management, and environmental monitoring. Detailed surveys of colonial territories produced maps and charts that continue to serve as references for understanding regional geography. Ethnographic documentation of indigenous cultures by imperial administrators and researchers preserved knowledge of languages, customs, and traditions that might otherwise have been lost. While these records often reflected imperial biases and purposes, they also provide valuable information for contemporary efforts to preserve and revive traditional cultures. The transportation networks developed to serve imperial administration created infrastructure that facilitated post-independence economic development. Roads, railways, ports, and airports built for colonial purposes provided foundations for contemporary transportation systems throughout Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Communication technologies developed for imperial coordination enabled new forms of international cooperation and cultural exchange. The submarine cable networks that connected imperial capitals to distant territories created the infrastructure for global telecommunications that continues to facilitate international commerce and cultural interaction. As we reflect on these detailed accounts of imperial achievement and consequence, we see that the story of world empires is ultimately inseparable from the broader story of human technological, cultural, and political development. The innovations, institutions, and networks created by imperial expansion continue to influence contemporary societies in ways both obvious and subtle. The measurement and analysis of these imperial legacies provides essential context for understanding contemporary global challenges and opportunities. The same drives toward expansion, integration, and control that motivated historical empires continue to operate in contemporary politics, economics, and culture. In the quiet depths of night, when the immediate concerns of daily life fade into the background of consciousness, we can appreciate the vast scope and enduring influence of these human experiments in organizing power across space and time. The empires we have explored represent humanity's most ambitious attempts to create order, prosperity, and meaning on a planetary scale. Rest now, knowing that you are part of this continuing human story of political innovation, cultural development, and the eternal quest to create institutions worthy of our highest aspirations while remaining grounded in practical realities of governing diverse populations across vast territories. Sleep well, surrounded by the invisible networks and persistent influences of 2 millennia of imperial achievement, knowing that tomorrow will bring new opportunities to participate in this ongoing human experiment in cooperation, governance, and the never-ending challenge of creating better ways to organize our shared life on this planet. The Byzantine Empire, which carried the Roman legacy in the East for over 1,000 years, developed administrative innovations that enabled survival through challenges that destroyed other imperial systems. The theme system, implemented in the 7th century, divided the empire into military districts governed by strategoi, who combined civilian and military authority. This system enabled more flexible response to external threats, while reducing the administrative costs that had burdened the later Roman Empire. Byzantine military organization centered on professional troops called Scolae Palatinae, supported by thematic armies recruited from free peasant farmers who received land grants in exchange for military service. This system maintained effective defence forces while avoiding the enormous costs of purely mercenary armies that had contributed to Roman fiscal crisis. The empire's survival strategy relied heavily on diplomatic sophistication that maintained complex relationships with enemies and allies across Europe, Asia, and North Africa. Byzantine diplomacy employed techniques including royal marriages, tribute payments, religious conversion, and playing rival powers against each other. The imperial chancery maintained correspondence in over a dozen languages and employed translators familiar with the customs and political systems of kingdoms from Ireland to Ethiopia. Constantinople's massive land and sea walls, constructed and repeatedly strengthened between the 5th and 15th centuries, created the most formidable urban fortifications in the medieval world. The Theodosian walls extended 5.7 kilometres across the landward side of the city, featuring double walls with 96 towers and a deep moat. These fortifications successfully resisted sieges by Avars, Arabs, Bulgars, Russians and Crusaders over 9 centuries. The empire's economic foundation rested on control of trade routes connecting Europe to Asia, generating customs revenues that supported imperial administration and military forces. The Book of the Epoch, a 10th century commercial regulation, documents 22 different trade guilds operating in Constantinople, each with specific privileges, obligations and quality standards enforced by imperial officials. Byzantine technological achievements included the development of Greek fire, an incendiary weapon that remained effective for over 400 years and whose exact composition was successfully kept secret throughout the empire's existence. Imperial workshops also perfected silk production techniques learned from Chinese sources, creating luxury textiles that were exported throughout Europe and the Islamic world. The empire's educational system preserved classical learning through institutions like the Magnora School, which maintained libraries containing over 200,000 manuscripts in Greek, Latin, Arabic, and other languages. Byzantine scholars preserved and transmitted classical texts that would later fuel the Renaissance in Western Europe, while also producing original works in theology, law, history, and natural philosophy. Byzantine influence extended far beyond the empire's territorial boundaries through Orthodox Christianity, which spread to Russia, the Balkans, and parts of the Middle East. The conversion of Vladimir I of Kiev in 988 established Orthodox Christianity in Russia and created cultural connections that influenced Eastern European development for centuries. The final siege of Constantinople in 1453 demonstrated both the persistence of Byzantine resistance and the technological advantages that enabled Ottoman victory. Sultan Mehmed II employed Hungarian engineer Orban to cast cannons capable of breaching the ancient walls, while Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI died fighting alongside his soldiers in the final assault. In the Americas, the Aztec Empire created one of the most sophisticated urban civilizations in the pre-Columbian world. Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital built on an island in Lake Texcoco, housed an estimated 200,000 to 300,000 inhabitants connected to the mainland by 3 major causeways and supplied by an intricate system of canals and floating gardens called chinampas. The chinampas system transformed the shallow waters of Lake Texcoco into highly productive agricultural land capable of supporting dense urban populations. Archaeological surveys have identified over 12,000 hectares of chinampas around Tenochtitlan, producing maize, beans, squash, and other crops through intensive cultivation techniques that achieved yields exceeding those of contemporary European agriculture. Aztec tribute systems documented in codices like the Codex Mendoza recorded payments from 371 tributary towns, totaling millions of cacao beans, thousands of cotton garments, hundreds of tons of maize, and luxury items including gold, jade, and exotic feathers. The empire's wealth enabled the construction of massive temples, palaces, and public works that impressed Spanish conquistadors despite their cultural prejudices. The Templo Mayor in Tenochtitlan rose approximately 60 meters above the city centre and required the labour of thousands of workers over multiple construction phases. Archaeological excavations have revealed over 200 ritual offerings buried within the temple structure, including objects from throughout Mesoamerica that demonstrate the empire's extensive trade networks. Aztec military organization enabled the conquest of territories spanning much of central Mexico within 2 centuries. Aztec armies employed weapons including obsidian-edged swords, atlatl spear throwers, and cotton armor that provided effective protection against traditional Mesoamerican weapons while remaining light enough for rapid movement. The empire's educational system trained noble youth in specialized schools called Calmecac, where they studied astronomy, mathematics, rhetoric, and military strategy. Aztec calendrical knowledge was recorded in stone monuments and codices that tracked multiple interlocking cycles with precision comparable to contemporary European astronomical calculations. Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire was facilitated by epidemic diseases that killed an estimated 80 to 90% of the indigenous population within a century. Smallpox, typhus, and other Old World diseases created demographic catastrophes that destroyed the labor systems supporting Aztec urban civilization. The Inca Empire, known as Tawantinsuyu, controlled territories extending 4,000 kilometers along the western coast of South America and governed an estimated 12 million subjects speaking dozens of different languages. Inca administration divided the empire into 4 suyus, quarters, connected by an extensive road system totaling over 40,000 kilometers. Inca road construction overcame extraordinary geographic obstacles, including mountain passes exceeding 5,000 meters in elevation, suspension bridges spanning deep gorges, and tunnel systems carved through solid rock. The Chapacñan, Royal Road, enabled communications between Cusco and the farthest provinces within 2 weeks, facilitating administrative control across territories larger than the Roman Empire. The Mita labor system required all adult subjects to contribute work for imperial projects, including road construction, agricultural terracing, and military service. This corvée labor enabled the construction of massive stone structures like Sacsayhuaman, whose precisely fitted stones weighing up to 200 tons were moved and positioned using techniques that remain imperfectly understood. Inca agricultural terraces covered an estimated 1 million hectares throughout the Andes, creating farmland in steep mountain terrain while preventing soil erosion. These terrace systems included sophisticated drainage networks, climate-controlled growing areas, and storage facilities that could preserve food for several years. The Quipu record-keeping system used knotted strings to encode information about tribute obligations, population censuses, and historical events. While the full meaning of Quipu remains partially undeciphered, Spanish colonial sources indicate that trained specialists could record and retrieve complex information using these devices. Inca religious and administrative centers like Machu Picchu demonstrated advanced architectural techniques, including earthquake-resistant construction, water management systems, and astronomical alignments. The site's location at 2,430 meters elevation required transporting massive stone blocks up precipitous mountain slopes using human labor and simple tools. Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire between 1532 and 1572 was facilitated by civil war between rival claimants to imperial succession, epidemic diseases that devastated indigenous populations, and Spanish military technology including horses, steel weapons, and firearms unfamiliar to Andean peoples. Colonial administration of former Inca territories through the Viceroyalty of Peru extracted enormous wealth through silver mining, particularly at Potosi, which produced an estimated 45,000 tons of silver between 1545 and 1800. This production required forced labor systems that killed hundreds of thousands of indigenous workers while generating revenues that financed Spanish imperial expansion worldwide. The Russian Empire, emerging from the Muscovite Principality in the 15th century, eventually controlled over 22.4 million square kilometers and governed approximately 180 million subjects, representing over 100 different ethnic groups. Russian expansion occurred primarily through overland conquest and colonization, rather than overseas empire building. Russian conquest of Siberia between 1580 and 1647 covered 13 million square kilometers in less than 70 years, representing the fastest territorial expansion in recorded history. Cossack expeditions following river systems penetrated to the Pacific Ocean, while establishing tribute collection systems among indigenous peoples. The Yasak tribute system required Siberian peoples to provide fur payments, particularly sable pelts that became luxury items in European and Asian markets. Russian fur trade generated revenues exceeding 200,000 rubles annually during peak periods, financing further expansion and military modernization. Peter the Great's reforms beginning in 1696 transformed Russia from a peripheral European kingdom into a major imperial power. The construction of St. Petersburg required the labour of over 100,000 workers and the expenditure of enormous resources to create a European-style capital in challenging northern climate conditions. Russian military reforms under Peter I created armed forces exceeding 200,000 men organised according to European models and equipped with modern firearms and artillery. Russian victory over Sweden in the Great Northern War 1700 to 1721 established Russian control over the Baltic Sea and access to European trade networks. The expansion of Russian territory into Central Asia during the 19th century brought the empire into competition with British India in what became known as the Great Game. Russian conquest of the Khanates of Khiva, Bukhara, and Kokand extended imperial control to Afghanistan's borders while securing access to Central Asian cotton and other resources. Russian colonial administration in Central Asia employed indirect rule through existing local authorities, while gradually introducing Russian legal systems, educational institutions and settlement programs. Russian settlers established agricultural colonies that displaced traditional nomadic peoples while creating new demographic patterns that persist today. The Trans-Siberian Railway, constructed between 1891 and 1916, extended 9,289 kilometres from Moscow to Vladivostok and enabled effective administrative control over Siberian territories for the first time. Railway construction required overcoming enormous engineering challenges, including permafrost, mountain ranges and river crossings, while operating in extreme climate conditions. Russian Orthodox missionary activities throughout the empire converted millions of indigenous peoples, while creating educational institutions that spread literacy and Russian cultural influence. The Orthodox Church operated over 50,000 parishes by 1914, making it one of the world's largest religious organizations. The collapse of the Russian Empire during World War I and the Russian Revolution resulted from military defeats, economic crisis, and popular uprisings that revealed the fundamental weaknesses of autocratic rule over such diverse territories. The war killed over 2 million Russian soldiers while creating economic disruption that undermined imperial authority. The Austro-Hungarian Empire represented a unique experiment in governing multi-ethnic populations through constitutional monarchy and federal administrative systems. The dual monarchy, established in 1867, recognised Hungarian autonomy while maintaining Austrian control over other imperial territories. The empire governed over 50 million subjects speaking 11 different languages and practicing multiple religions including Catholicism, Protestantism, Orthodox Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. Administrative complexity required translation services, separate educational systems, and accommodation of diverse legal traditions within a unified imperial framework. Austro-Hungarian military forces totaled approximately 400,000 men organised into regiments that reflected the empire's ethnic diversity. Military commands were issued in German, but soldiers could use their native languages for internal communication, creating polyglot armies that functioned despite linguistic barriers. The empire's industrial development during the 19th century created manufacturing centres in Bohemia, Galicia, and other regions that employed advanced technologies and competed effectively with Western European producers. Austro-Hungarian steel production exceeded 2 million tonnes annually by 1914, while textile industries employed over 500,000 workers. Vienna's role as imperial capital attracted artists, intellectuals and musicians from throughout the empire, creating cultural synthesis that influenced European art, music and literature. The city's population grew from 400,000 in 1800 to over 2 million by 1914, making it one of Europe's largest urban centres. The empire's collapse during World War I resulted from military defeats, ethnic nationalism, and economic exhaustion that made continued unity impossible. The creation of successor states, including Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, and Yugoslavia, represented both the triumph of national self-determination and the fragmentation of Central European economic and cultural networks. Colonial Australia developed as a unique imperial experiment combining convict transportation, free settlement, and indigenous dispossession across a continent-sized territory. British settlement beginning in 1788 eventually displaced Aboriginal populations estimated at 300,000 to 1 million people through disease, violence, and land appropriation. The discovery of gold in Victoria, New South Wales during the 1850s attracted over 600,000 immigrants and transformed colonial Australia from a penal colony into a prosperous settler society. Gold production totalling over 1,000 tonnes between 1851 and 1860 generated wealth that financed infrastructure development and urban growth. Australian colonial administration evolved from direct imperial control toward responsible government during the 19th century, with colonies achieving internal self-government while remaining within the British Empire. Federation in 1901 created the Commonwealth of Australia as a dominion with constitutional autonomy in domestic affairs. The development of sheep farming in Australian colonies created one of the world's largest wool industries, with flocks totalling over 100 million animals by 1890. Wool exports generated revenues exceeding £20 million annually, making Australia one of the British Empire's most valuable possessions. Aboriginal resistance to European colonisation included both military campaigns and cultural adaptation strategies that enabled survival despite enormous pressures. The frontier wars continued sporadically until the early 20th century, while Aboriginal peoples developed new forms of social organisation adapted to colonial conditions. Colonial South Africa represented another complex imperial experiment involving multiple European settler populations, diverse African societies, and economic systems based on mineral extraction and agricultural production. Dutch settlement beginning in 1652 established agricultural colonies that gradually expanded inland, displacing Khoikhoi and San peoples. British conquest of the Cape Colony during the Napoleonic Wars brought South Africa into the British Empire and created tensions with Dutch settlers that persisted throughout the 19th century. The Great Trek of the 1830s saw approximately 15,000 Dutch settlers migrate inland to escape British authority and establish independent republics. The discovery of diamonds at Kimberley in 1867 and gold on the Witwatersrand in 1886 transformed South Africa into a major mineral producer and attracted international investment that funded railway construction and industrial development. Gold production exceeded 200 tonnes annually by 1900, making South Africa the world's largest producer. The South African War, 1899 to 1902, demonstrated both the costs of imperial expansion and the brutality of modern warfare. British forces eventually defeated Afrikaner republics through scorched earth tactics and concentration camps that held over 100,000 civilian prisoners, including approximately 26,000 who died from disease and malnutrition. The Union of South Africa, established in 1910, created a dominion that excluded African, Indian and mixed-race populations from political participation while maintaining British imperial connections. This exclusionary system provided the foundation for apartheid policies that would persist until the 1990s. The Persian Empire under the Safavid dynasty, 1501 to 1736, created a distinctive synthesis of Shia Islam and Persian cultural traditions that influenced Middle Eastern development for centuries. The empire controlled territories spanning modern Iran, Afghanistan, parts of Iraq, and the Caucasus, governing populations estimated at 8 to 10 million people. Safavid military power relied on Kizilbash tribal warriors and Ghulam slave soldiers recruited from Georgia and the Caucasus. This dual military system enabled expansion against Ottoman and Uzbek enemies, while maintaining internal control over traditionally fragmented Iranian territories. The capital city of Isfahan under Shah Abbas I, 1588 to 1629, became one of the world's most beautiful urban centres, with magnificent mosques, palaces, and public buildings that demonstrated Persian architectural achievements. The city's population exceeded 600,000 inhabitants, making it larger than most European capitals. Safavid economic policies promoted international trade through merchants who operated throughout Asia and established commercial relationships with European trading companies. Persian silk exports generated substantial revenues, while artisans produced carpets, textiles, and luxury goods that were prized throughout the Islamic world. The empire's promotion of Shia Islam created religious identity that distinguished Persia from Sunni neighbours and provided ideological unity among diverse ethnic groups. Religious scholars and institutions received royal patronage while serving as administrators and judges throughout imperial territories. Safavid artistic achievements included miniature painting, calligraphy, and architectural decoration that synthesized Persian, Islamic, and Central Asian influences. The Shah Mosque in Isfahan and other Safavid monuments represent pinnacles of Islamic architectural achievement. The empire's decline during the 18th century resulted from military weakness, economic problems, and invasion by Afghan forces that captured Isfahan in 1722. The Safavid collapse led to a period of political fragmentation that lasted until the rise of the Qajar dynasty in 1794. The Mughal Empire in India achieved perhaps the most successful synthesis of Islamic and Hindu traditions in world history, governing territories that encompassed most of the Indian subcontinent and populations exceeding 150 million people at its peak. Mughal administrative systems combined Persian bureaucratic traditions with Indian revenue collection methods to create effective governance of religiously and culturally diverse populations. The Mansabdari system integrated military and civilian administration, while providing advancement opportunities for talented individuals regardless of religious or ethnic background. Emperor Akbar's religious tolerance policies enabled effective governance of Hindu-majority populations while maintaining Islamic imperial identity. The Din-i-Ilahi attempted to create syncretic religious practices that would unite diverse imperial subjects, though this experiment had limited lasting influence. Mughal architectural achievements, including the Taj Mahal, represent fusion of Persian, Central Asian, and Indian design traditions that created distinctive Indo-Islamic styles. Construction of the Taj Mahal between 1632 and 1648 employed over 20,000 workers and craftsmen, while requiring precious materials transported from throughout Asia. The empire's wealth derived from agricultural revenues collected through the Zabd system, which assessed land productivity and collected taxes in cash rather than kind. Imperial revenues during the 17th century totaled approximately 100 million rupees annually, making the Mughal Empire one of the world's wealthiest states. Mughal military forces included war elephants, cavalry, and infantry, equipped with firearms imported from European and Ottoman sources. The empire maintained standing armies exceeding 200,000 men, while also relying on provincial governors who provided additional military forces when required. The empire's gradual decline during the 18th century was accelerated by administrative decentralization, regional rebellions and foreign invasions, including Persian and Afghan attacks on imperial capitals. The rise of Maratha power in central India and British East India Company expansion gradually reduced Mughal authority to the immediate vicinity of Delhi. The Industrial Revolution that began in 18th century Britain created new forms of imperial power, based on technological advantages rather than simply military conquest. Steam engines, factory production, railway transportation, and telegraphic communication gave European powers unprecedented capabilities for controlling distant territories. British industrial supremacy enabled the production of manufactured goods at prices that undermined traditional craft production throughout Asia and Africa. Indian textile industries that had dominated global markets for centuries were destroyed by competition from mechanized British factories, producing cotton goods at a fraction of traditional costs. Railway construction in India between 1850 and 1914 created a network exceeding 65,000 kilometres that transformed the subcontinent's economy while facilitating imperial control. Railway projects required the investment of approximately £400 million while employing over 1 million Indian workers and generating substantial profits for British investors. The telegraph networks that connected British territories enabled imperial coordination at unprecedented speed, with messages travelling from London to Calcutta in hours rather than months. The development of undersea cables created global communication networks that linked the British Empire and facilitated international commerce. Steam navigation reduced travel times between Britain and India from 6 months to 6 weeks, enabling more frequent communication and faster deployment of military forces when required. Steamship services also facilitated increased migration between imperial territories and the movement of goods at reduced costs. Military technologies, including rifled firearms, breech-loading artillery and explosive shells, gave European forces decisive advantages over traditional armies. The Indian Rebellion of 1857 demonstrated both the potential for indigenous resistance and the overwhelming technological advantages that enabled European powers to maintain imperial control. Medical advances including vaccination, quinine treatment for malaria, and improved sanitation enabled European survival in tropical climates that had previously been lethal for outsiders. These medical innovations made possible the European colonization of Africa and Southeast Asia during the late 19th century. The demographic consequences of industrial imperialism included massive population movements as European settlers migrated to temperate colonies, while indentured labourers were transported between tropical territories. These migrations created new ethnic compositions and cultural mixtures throughout imperial territories. Environmental transformations accompanying industrial imperialism included deforestation, mineral extraction, and agricultural specialization that altered landscapes and ecosystems throughout colonized territories. Colonial plantations producing rubber, palm oil, coffee, and other export crops replaced indigenous forests and disrupted traditional agricultural systems. The social consequences of industrial imperialism included the creation of new class structures that combined traditional hierarchies with categories based on race, education, and economic function. Colonial societies developed complex systems of racial classification and social stratification that persisted long after political independence. Cultural impacts of industrial imperialism included the spread of European languages, legal systems, and educational institutions that displaced or marginalized traditional knowledge systems. Colonial schools taught European curricula while suppressing indigenous languages and cultural practices. Economic integration under industrial imperialism created global markets for primary commodities while concentrating manufacturing in European centres. This division of labour generated enormous wealth for imperial powers while creating economic dependencies that limited development options in colonised territories. The costs of maintaining industrial empires eventually exceeded their benefits as military expenses increased, administrative burdens multiplied, and colonised peoples organised increasingly effective resistance movements. The two world wars demonstrated the vulnerability of European powers and accelerated demands for independence throughout Asia and Africa. Decolonisation after World War II represented one of the most rapid political transformations in world history, with over 70 new nations achieving independence between 1945 and 1975. This transformation was facilitated by changes in international law, economic relationships, and military technology that made traditional imperial control increasingly difficult and expensive to maintain. The legacy of world empires continues to influence contemporary international relations through institutional structures, cultural practices, economic relationships, and political boundaries established during imperial periods. Understanding these imperial legacies remains essential for comprehending current global challenges and opportunities. In the deepening quiet of night, as consciousness gradually releases its hold on immediate concerns, we can appreciate the vast scope of human ambition and achievement represented by these imperial experiments. Each empire believed it was creating something permanent and valuable, yet each discovered that even the most sophisticated human institutions remain subject to the forces of change that shape all earthly endeavours. Rest peacefully, knowing that you participate in this continuing human story of political innovation and cultural development, connected across time to all those who have struggled with the eternal challenges of creating order, prosperity, and meaning in our shared world. Imperial expansion created unprecedented opportunities for cultural exchange, artistic innovation, and intellectual synthesis that produced some of humanity's greatest achievements in art, architecture, literature, and learning. The mixing of different cultural traditions under imperial rule generated new forms of creative expression that often outlasted the political systems that made them possible. Roman cultural synthesis absorbed and transformed Greek, Etruscan, Egyptian, and Near Eastern traditions to create distinctive Roman forms of art and architecture that influenced European development for 2 millennia. Roman architects developed new construction techniques, including the systematic use of concrete and the architectural principles of the arch, dome, and vault that enabled the construction of buildings larger and more durable than any previous structures. The Pantheon in Rome, completed under Hadrian around 128 CE, demonstrated Roman architectural capabilities through its unreinforced concrete dome, which remained the largest such structure in the world for over 1,300 years. The building's perfect proportions and innovative engineering techniques influenced architects throughout European history, while its preservation demonstrates the durability of Roman construction methods. Roman sculpture evolved from Greek models to create portraiture that emphasized individual character and personality rather than idealized beauty. Roman sculptors developed techniques for realistic representation that captured the specific features and expressions of their subjects, creating artistic records of imperial personalities that provide insights into Roman cultural values and aesthetic preferences. Roman literature synthesized Greek literary forms with distinctively Roman themes and perspectives to create works that defined Western literary tradition. Virgil's Aeneid combined Greek epic conventions with Roman historical themes to create national mythology that justified imperial expansion while celebrating Roman cultural achievements. Ovid's Metamorphoses preserved Greek and Roman mythological traditions while exploring themes of transformation and change that reflected the cultural mixing characteristic of imperial society. Roman educational systems spread literacy and learning throughout the empire, while creating shared cultural references that promoted imperial unity. Roman schools taught standardized curricula that enabled students from Britain to Syria to share common knowledge of literature, history, and philosophy, creating cultural connections that transcended ethnic and linguistic differences. Chinese cultural synthesis under imperial rule created artistic and intellectual traditions that influenced East Asian civilization for over 2 millennia. Chinese imperial patronage supported artistic and literary achievements that demonstrated the sophistication and refinement of Chinese civilization while promoting cultural unity across the empire's vast territories. The Chinese examination system created unprecedented demand for literary and artistic skills that supported thriving cultural industries. Chinese painters, calligraphers, and poets could achieve social status and economic success through artistic excellence, creating incentives for cultural innovation that produced some of the world's finest artistic achievements. Chinese landscape painting developed under imperial patronage to create new artistic techniques for representing natural beauty and philosophical concepts. Chinese painters used innovative perspective and composition techniques to create works that were simultaneously realistic representations of natural scenes and symbolic expressions of Confucian and Taoist philosophical principles. Chinese poetry achieved extraordinary sophistication through the work of imperial court poets who created new literary forms and refined classical traditions. Poets like Li Bai and Du Fu, who wrote during the Tang dynasty, produced works that combined technical excellence with emotional depth and philosophical insight, creating literary standards that influenced Chinese culture for centuries. Chinese technological innovation was often supported by imperial patronage and motivated by imperial needs. Chinese inventors developed printing technology, gunpowder, and magnetic compass under imperial auspices, creating innovations that would eventually transform global civilization. Chinese technological achievements were often integrated with artistic and literary traditions, as seen in the production of beautifully illustrated printed books. Islamic cultural synthesis created new forms of art and architecture that combined Arab, Persian, Byzantine, and local traditions to produce distinctive Islamic styles that spread throughout the Islamic world. Islamic artists and architects developed innovative techniques for geometric decoration, calligraphy, and architectural design that reflected Islamic religious principles while incorporating influences from conquered territories. Islamic architecture created new building types including the mosque, madrasa, and caravanserai that served both religious and practical functions, while demonstrating the sophistication of Islamic civilization. The Great Mosque of Córdoba, built during the Umayyad period in Spain, combined Roman, Visigothic, and Islamic architectural elements to create a unique structure that influenced architectural development throughout Europe and North Africa. Islamic decorative arts achieved unprecedented sophistication through the development of geometric patterns, arabesque designs, and calligraphic techniques that could transform any surface into works of art. Islamic artists developed mathematical principles for creating complex geometric patterns that reflected Islamic concepts of divine order and perfection. Islamic scholarship preserved and transmitted classical knowledge from Greek, Persian, and Indian sources while making original contributions to mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad became a major centre of translation and research that preserved classical texts and created new knowledge that would later influence European intellectual development. Islamic literature developed new literary forms including the maqama, a type of narrative prose that influenced storytelling traditions throughout the Islamic world. Works like The 1001 Nights synthesized folk tales from different cultures to create literary collections that demonstrated the diversity and richness of Islamic civilization. Ottoman cultural synthesis combined Islamic, Byzantine, and Central Asian traditions to create distinctive Ottoman forms of art and architecture. Ottoman architects developed innovative techniques for dome construction and space organization that enabled the creation of mosques and palaces that rivaled the greatest achievements of previous civilizations. The Süleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul, designed by the architect Sinan in the 16th century, represents the culmination of Ottoman architectural achievement. The mosque's innovative structural system enabled the creation of vast interior spaces covered by a central dome, while its integration with surrounding buildings created urban complexes that served both religious and social functions. Ottoman decorative arts achieved remarkable sophistication through the development of tilework, textiles, and metalwork that combined traditional Islamic techniques with innovations that reflected the empire's multicultural character. Ottoman artists created new styles of ceramic decoration, textile design, and calligraphy that influenced artistic development throughout the Islamic world. Ottoman literature synthesized Arabic, Persian, and Turkish literary traditions to create new forms of poetry and prose that reflected the empire's cultural diversity. Ottoman poets like Fuzuli and Baki created works that combined classical forms with innovative techniques, while Ottoman historians like Naima developed new approaches to historical writing that influenced historical scholarship throughout the Islamic world. Mughal cultural synthesis created new forms of Indo-Islamic art and architecture that combined Islamic, Persian, and Indian traditions to produce some of the world's most beautiful buildings and artistic works. Mughal architects developed innovative techniques for combining Islamic architectural principles with Indian decorative traditions, creating structures that were both religiously appropriate and aesthetically magnificent. The Taj Mahal, built by Shah Jahan as a tomb for his wife Mumtaz Mahal, represents perhaps the greatest achievement of Mughal architecture. The building's perfect proportions, innovative construction techniques, and exquisite decorative details demonstrate the technical and artistic capabilities that could be achieved through the synthesis of different cultural traditions under imperial patronage. Mughal painting developed new techniques for combining Persian and Indian artistic traditions to create distinctive styles that influenced artistic development throughout South Asia. Mughal artists created innovative approaches to portraiture, landscape painting, and book illustration that demonstrated both technical excellence and cultural sensitivity. Mughal literature produced works that synthesized Islamic, Persian, and Indian literary traditions while creating new forms of expression that reflected the empire's multicultural character. The Mughal Emperor Akbar sponsored translations of Sanskrit texts into Persian, while Mughal poets created works that combined classical forms with innovative techniques. European colonial cultural exchange created new forms of artistic expression through the encounter between European and non-European traditions. European artists working in colonial territories developed new techniques for representing unfamiliar landscapes, peoples, and cultural practices, while indigenous artists adapted European techniques to express traditional themes and values. Colonial architecture created hybrid styles that combined European construction techniques with local materials and climatic adaptations. Buildings like the Governor's Palace in Williamsburg, Virginia, or the churches of colonial Mexico represent attempts to recreate European architectural forms using local resources and construction techniques. European colonial collecting created the first global museums and libraries that preserved and displayed artistic and cultural objects from throughout the world. While colonial collecting often involved cultural appropriation and the removal of objects from their original contexts, it also created institutions that preserved cultural artifacts that might otherwise have been lost. The cultural legacies of imperial expansion continue to influence contemporary art, architecture, and intellectual development throughout the world. Former imperial capitals like Rome, Istanbul, Beijing, and London retain architectural monuments and cultural institutions that were created during imperial periods, while former colonial territories continue to grapple with cultural identities that were shaped by centuries of imperial rule. Understanding imperial cultural history reveals both the creative possibilities and destructive consequences of cultural encounter under conditions of political inequality. Imperial cultural synthesis created some of humanity's greatest artistic achievements while often destroying or marginalizing indigenous cultural traditions. The challenge for contemporary societies is to learn from imperial cultural achievements while addressing the inequalities and injustices that made them possible. The great imperial cities that served as centers of power, administration, and cultural life represented unprecedented achievements in urban planning, architectural design, and the organization of complex human communities. These cities were simultaneously expressions of imperial ideology, demonstrations of technical capability, and laboratories for developing new approaches to managing large populations in concentrated urban environments. Rome at its imperial peak housed over 1 million inhabitants, making it the largest city in the ancient world and demonstrating Roman capabilities in urban infrastructure, food distribution, and public administration. The city's 14 aqueducts delivered over 1 billion litres of fresh water daily from sources up to 95 kilometres away, while an elaborate system of sewers and drains removed wastewater and prevented the accumulation of sewage that plagued other ancient cities. Roman urban planning created public spaces on scales that had never been attempted before. The Forum Romanum, the Baths of Caracalla, and the Colosseum demonstrated Roman ability to construct buildings that could accommodate tens of thousands of people, while providing amenities including running water, central heating, and complex entertainment facilities. The Roman insulae, multi-storey apartment buildings that housed the city's working population, represented innovations in urban housing that would not be matched again until the modern era. Some Roman apartment buildings reached 6 or 7 stories and housed hundreds of residents, requiring sophisticated construction techniques and management systems to maintain safety and habitability. Roman commercial districts created new forms of urban economic organization through the development of specialized markets, workshops, and storage facilities that could serve a population exceeding 1 million people. The markets of Trajan included over 150 shops arranged in multiple levels, creating shopping complexes that provided convenient access to goods from throughout the empire. Chang'an during the Tang dynasty became the world's largest city, with a population exceeding 1 million people, organized within a planned urban grid that covered over 80 square kilometers. The city's geometric layout reflected Chinese cosmological principles, while providing efficient organization for administration, commerce, and residential life. The Chinese system of urban planning created cities that could accommodate enormous populations, while maintaining social order and cultural coherence. Chang'an's 108 residential wards were separated by wide avenues that could accommodate official processions and prevent the spread of fires, while the city's markets, temples, and government buildings were strategically located to serve their respective populations efficiently. Chinese urban architecture created new building types including pagodas, palace complexes, and gardens that demonstrated Chinese aesthetic principles while serving practical functions. The Daming Palace in Chang'an covered over 3 square kilometers and included hundreds of buildings that provided space for imperial administration, court ceremonies, and imperial residential life. Chinese cities became centers of technological innovation through the concentration of craftsmen, scholars, and merchants who could exchange knowledge and techniques. Urban workshops in Chinese cities developed new technologies, including printing, gunpowder, and mechanical clocks, that would eventually influence global technological development. Baghdad during the Abbasid period was constructed as a planned city that could serve as the administrative and cultural center of the Islamic world. The city's circular design, with the caliph's palace at the center and residential districts arranged in concentric rings, reflected Islamic principles of social organization while providing practical solutions for urban administration and defense. The round city of Baghdad included innovative urban infrastructure including running water, waste removal systems, and public facilities that enabled urban life in a harsh desert environment. The city's location at the intersection of major trade routes made it a natural center for international commerce, while its cultural institutions attracted scholars and artists from throughout the Islamic world. Islamic urban planning created new types of public spaces, including the masjid, madrasa, and bazaar that served both religious and commercial functions, while providing centers for community life. Islamic cities developed sophisticated systems for regulating commerce, maintaining public order, and providing social services that influenced urban development throughout the Islamic world. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad became one of the world's great centers of learning through the concentration of scholars, translators, and researchers who preserved and expanded human knowledge. The institution's library contained hundreds of thousands of manuscripts from throughout the known world, while its research facilities enabled scholars to make original contributions to mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. Constantinople, rebuilt by Constantine as the New Rome, combined Roman urban planning principles with Christian architectural symbolism to create a city that would serve as the Eastern Roman capital for over 1,000 years. The city's strategic location at the intersection of Europe and Asia made it a natural centre for international trade, while its massive fortifications enabled it to withstand numerous sieges throughout its history. The Hagia Sophia in Constantinople represented one of the greatest achievements of imperial architecture through its innovative structural system that enabled the construction of the largest enclosed space in the world for nearly 1,000 years. The building's architectural influence extended throughout Europe and Asia, while its preservation through multiple political transitions demonstrated the durability of exceptional architectural achievement. Byzantine urban planning adapted Roman techniques to accommodate Christian religious practices and changing military requirements. The city's hippodrome provided space for public entertainment and political demonstration, while its numerous churches and monasteries served both religious and social functions. Constantinople's economic organization created one of the world's most sophisticated urban economies through the combination of international trade, local manufacturing, and imperial administration. The city's guilds regulated craft production and commercial activities, while providing social services and maintaining technical standards that enabled Constantinople to remain prosperous for over a millennium. Cordoba during the Umayyad period became one of Europe's largest and most sophisticated cities through Islamic urban planning that combined Iberian, Roman and Islamic traditions. The city's great mosque demonstrated Islamic architectural capabilities, while its urban infrastructure, including running water, paved streets, and public lighting, created living conditions that exceeded those of any contemporary European city. Islamic Cordoba became a major centre of learning through its libraries, schools and research institutions that attracted scholars from throughout Europe and the Islamic world. The city's cultural synthesis created new forms of philosophical, scientific and literary expression that influenced European intellectual development for centuries. Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, demonstrated that sophisticated urban planning could develop independently of European and Asian models. The city's island location in Lake Texcoco required innovative engineering solutions, including artificial islands, canals, and causeways that enabled urban life in an aquatic environment. The Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés described Tenochtitlan as exceeding any European city in size and sophistication, with a population estimated at 1,000,000 at 200,000 to 300,000 people, served by elaborate systems of canals, markets, and ceremonial buildings. The city's destruction during Spanish conquest represented one of history's greatest losses of urban architectural heritage. European colonial cities created new forms of urban organization that combined European planning principles with local environmental conditions and cultural practices. Cities like Havana, Manila, and Goa developed distinctive architectural styles and urban layouts that reflected their roles as administrative centres for global empires. Colonial urban planning often involved the systematic reorganisation of existing cities or the creation of entirely new urban centres that could serve imperial administrative and commercial needs. The Spanish laws of the Indies created standardised planning principles that were applied to colonial cities throughout the Americas, creating urban landscapes that remained recognisable for centuries. British colonial cities like Calcutta, Bombay, and Singapore combined European administrative requirements with local commercial and cultural traditions to create hybrid urban forms that served both imperial and local needs. These cities often became major centres of international trade, while developing distinctive architectural and cultural characteristics. The urban legacy of imperial expansion continues to shape contemporary cities throughout the world. Former imperial capitals retain architectural monuments, urban layouts, and cultural institutions that were created during imperial periods. While former colonial cities continue to reflect the urban planning principles and architectural styles that were imposed during colonial rule, understanding imperial urban history reveals both the achievements and limitations of historical urban planning, while providing insights into contemporary challenges of urban development, cultural preservation, and the management of diverse urban populations. The great imperial cities represent some of humanity's most impressive achievements in creating complex urban environments, while also demonstrating the enormous resources and human labour that were required to support imperial urban life. As the night reaches its deepest hours, we can envision these vast urban landscapes that represented the pinnacle of human organisational achievement in their respective eras. The million residents of imperial Rome conducting their daily business along aqueduct-supplied streets, the cosmopolitan merchants and scholars gathering in the circular city of Baghdad, the intricate canal networks of Tenochtitlan supporting a population that rivaled contemporary Paris. These urban achievements demonstrate humanity's remarkable capacity for creating complex, functioning communities while revealing the enormous inequalities and exploitation that often made such achievements possible. Rest now with images of these great cities in your mind, their architectural monuments reaching toward the sky, their streets filled with people from every corner of the known world, their libraries and workshops pushing forward the boundaries of human knowledge and capability. These urban centres represented both the highest achievements and the greatest contradictions of imperial civilization, creating spaces of unprecedented cultural mixing and intellectual development, while depending on systems of extraction and exploitation that extended across continents. Tomorrow will bring new opportunities to learn from these historical achievements while working toward forms of urban development that can capture the creativity and dynamism of the great imperial cities while avoiding the patterns of inequality and exploitation that made them possible. The legacy of these urban achievements continues to influence contemporary city planning and architectural design, offering both inspiration and cautionary lessons for creating sustainable and equitable urban environments in our interconnected world. Sweet dreams of marble colonnades and towering pagodas, of bustling bazaars and quiet library courtyards, of the eternal human quest to create urban environments that can nurture both individual flourishing and collective achievement, while serving as centres for the cultural synthesis and technological innovation that have driven human progress throughout history.